Let me introduce our today's guest. It's my pleasure to host a very special guest tonight, Ted Rao. Ted, warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
It's really happening. That is now a part of Future of Work Talks, and I'm really curious what's going to happen tonight. So Ted is an advocate, trainer, and consultant for self-governance. His main focus is sociocracy. Ted co-founded Sociocracy For All and is a co-author of 2 books on self-governance. He's currently working on a new book, Collective Power, on self-organization patterns. And not by accident, the topic of today is patterns of self-organized future. Ted is going to answer the question, what are the patterns needed on the team level, organizational level, and in society to make collective power a reality? Hopefully this introduces you well. So I also know that you are a father of 5 children. So, and this brings me to the question, because some time ago, people involved in agility, it was very, very popular to introduce personal Kanban boards to their kids at home, just as an experiment, as kind of a new alternative to the official, education. And so I'm really curious, are you also introducing some elements of sociocracy in your family?
Well, yes. And I mean, yes. Like, for example, rounds, which is a typical thing from sociocracy we do from time to time. We had a meeting the other day because my 2 older kids are driving now. And so we're sharing 2 cars with 4 people. So we needed to make a policy about that. So yeah, I mean, those things happen. It's less than you would think, probably. And the biggest reason for that is that everybody is kind of everybody's in a different place all the time. Having, many people part of the same system, they're not all in the same place. So it's complicated. I've become a master of asynchronous decision making. 2 people get a text and 1 person I'm going to talk to, and it's complicated.
And is there any special voting mechanism when you trying to decide where to go for your holidays, for instance?
It's kind of what people who read Reinventing Organizations, or it's more a little bit of an advice process of just asking everybody individually and then kind of putting it out on a group text. There's a lot of decision making on text that is happening in my family. But it's a complex situation because the kids go back and forth between 2 houses, and it's a lot. And then there are a bunch of people kind of part of the system. So it's a very, at some point through the organizational structure of my family, it's really complicated because different domains are decided by very different people, including our wider community. I live in a community with 17 neighbors. So for some decisions, we also need to consult the other people, and step parents and whatnot. So there's a lot.
Awesome. So maybe my first kind of warm-up question still is, like, you're a very active evangelist of sociocracy, and before we jump into the details, I would like to ask you, like, what brought you into this context? What did you not like when working in classical organizations? So what is your journey to this sociocracy?
Yeah. Well, kind of coming from 2 sides. I mean, we all have some experience in power over system, right? So I've had my share of that. That wasn't so fun. And then there were a few other experiences. Like I remember in 10th grade, I would argue with my social studies teacher about whether or not democracy is a good system. I held the unpopular opinion and that I didn't find it so good of a system. Not that I had a better one, but anyway, that was a discussion. And then there were a few formative moments. So one of the formative moments was that I was maybe 22, and I was part of a group that organized like a summer university kind of a thing. And so we solicited proposals from people, and I was really excited about the proposals. But the way to make it fair was to vote, ask the membership to vote down half of the proposals. And I thought that was the most horrible thing I was ever part of, because it seemed so wasteful, so unfair to ask a bunch of uninformed people to make a decision based on hardly any information. And I left that and was like, I'm never going to do that away. It just felt so wrong on so many levels. But I didn't have a better idea, you know. So then when I encountered sociocracy, it was like, oh my, that's the thing that so many people are looking for. So, and the way I was introduced to that, I wasn't actually actively looking, was because I moved into this community that runs sociocratically. And the way they've been running before was that everybody was just making all the decisions together. So 70 people making a decision together, which was hard. So hard, in fact, that it led to a situation where more and more people were like, I'm not even going to propose anything. This is just annoying. So yeah, governance was on my radar. And then I was not involved in bringing it here, but then seeing it, it really got my attention for like, wait, this is the answer to a problem that I've been seeing for many, many years now. So I was excited about that. That's how I got here.
It sounds like it's, on one hand, it sounds like more difficult, but at the same time, more just or powerful.
Yeah, and that's kind of going right into the middle of my talk. I do agree that it is more difficult. I would argue that we don't have realistic alternatives though, because with what we're doing right now, like hierarchical decision-making disenfranchises so many people. I also draw a line kind of between governance system that allow us to dismiss or disregard or ignore information, lead to a situation where we just sideline facts, or like, you know, just treat something as an externality and just say like, yeah, okay, it's none of my problem, but it creates a system overall, like a system of systems, where some facts can just be ignored. And that's not a sustainable way of doing things. Ignoring parts of reality is not a wise idea. So I don't see good alternatives in the status quo that would convince me that not doing the work might be a good idea. So from my point of view, we only have, like, we need to all up our game around governance and governance literacy and be better at it. Yeah, which again goes back, goes right into the things I'm going to talk about.
And since you know, since you have both the backgrounds of the academic background and the business background, corporate background, can you see a big difference of where in which environment sociocracy is more natural or can bring bigger impact, or how do you position?
You know, it's really fascinating because one would assume that there's an easy answer there, and there's not, because to me the lines don't go around sectors or industries. They go around something completely different. So I've seen, you know, let's say for example intentional communities or co-ops, you know, worker co-ops or things like that, where there's a strong ethos of participation. One would assume that they would love sociocracy, and they sometimes struggle with the fact that not everybody will be a part of every decision. They also have a strong buy-in to voting, which I will talk about later, that why we don't do that. So while many cooperatives and kind of very participatory flat organizations are falling in love with sociocracy, there is also some resistance because it is more hierarchical than they would want to. On the other hand, there's the hierarchical spaces where one would assume that maybe they wouldn't like it, but I actually find that that with some certain cultural, whatever parameters, those organizations actually have a good handle on sociocracy. So it's a little counterintuitive. The way I would say with those that gravitate towards sociocracy and do it well, what they have in common is that they see governance as an issue that has a solution. Because if people don't do that, they just assume that the issues around organizations are in the interpersonal realm. You know, they're saying like, this boss is a jerk, or this neighbor of mine is an asshole, you know, like they see interpersonal relationships, they don't see organizational governance. As soon as people see organizational governance, they are more interested and also more open to those ideas as sociocracy, because then it answers a question that they had. So it doesn't, for me, the sector or the industry has almost nothing to do with how well it's going to go. It's completely up to those other factors in my experience. That said, you know, just because of, I guess, personal, what's the word? Those industries, there are some industries where it has spread faster or further. And some of it, I think, well, there are a few reasons for that, but like, for example, intentional communities, co-ops, tech spaces, consultancy firms, they are typically the groups that adopted the fastest, or where it's the most common. And one more thing about that, it's interesting to me, there are three typical entryways. One is agile, right? That's kind of where you're coming from, right? Agile as a way of working together. And then the question of like, wait, how do we include decision making? How do we scale agile? And then people arrive at systems like sociocracy, holacracy. Another way in is more through the interpersonal communication, like nonviolent communication. And another one is more through systems thinking, or systems like permaculture. Those are three very different directions that people can come from, but they often end up in that area.
Amazing, you mentioned these three. Yeah, these are very broadly known and, yeah, and accepted as very powerful concepts. And maybe I'm really like, I have hundreds of questions, so guys, please also feel free to like jump in and ask your questions. But just, I need to ask one more. So you focus on very much on the governance, right? And you and as I understand, this is where you predict and envision a kind of a huge breakthrough in how companies work, organizations work. Do you also see other areas that need to, because I personally see a lot of areas that I would like to kind of re-engineer or reinvent in organizations, not just the governance. Of course, governance is kind of one of the opening ones, but there's so much to change in organizations at the moment. Do you have also other fields of interest when it comes to what can be changed for better?
Well, communication is a big one. I guess here's how I see it. So if we say, if we go from individuals to interpersonal to organizational to society, there are different steps along the way. And again, I will talk about a little bit more about that, but within on the individual level, what is important is a sense of agency and clarity over what's like all the personal growth things also that coaching works on, like how can you have agency as a person and be in touch with the agency. To me, that's not only another topic, but it actually meshes with governance, because if you don't have that, you're going to fail on the governance end as well. Then interpersonal communication, like nonviolent communication, all of those. Having self-responsibility in how we talk and how we think. That's another huge area that needs addressing. And then, okay, then there's organizations, so governance and other things related to that. But then on a societal level, there's so many things that need to change, because for example, inequality, from my point of view, inequality makes governance and just running of organizations harder. So inequality per se is already a problem that just for the sake of our own sanity needs to be, not even, of course, also just for justice, but in general, it needs to be addressed because it makes everything else harder. And of course, all other forms of bias, maybe sexism, racism, all of those, classism, they create just friction even on an organizational level. So even just looking at organizations and looking left and right, I can tell, oh yeah, personal growth, communication, and inequality, those are all issues. So that's, you don't even have to zoom out far to just see those. And while we're on that topic, I also want to say that, yeah, while my main thing is governance, I'm not saying governance is the problem. There are many problems. I'm kind of a big fan of the mental frame of holding it as a meta crisis. The situation that we're in. So because there's so many compounding issues. So I'm not saying, oh, just fix governance and everything will be solved. There's a slogan that the philosopher Danish Machtenberger said, like, the solution to our the solution to our problems is all of the solutions, or the answer to our problems is all of the solutions. I think that's such a brilliant line, because to me, governance is just one of the things. But of course, I'm not saying, oh, the other things are not, like, governance is not more important than the others. All of them are important, and we need to deal with them all at the same time, unfortunately. There's one thing that makes governance a little bit in a separate category, but I'm sure one could argue another way as well. And that is that governance is the way in which we make like how we make decisions of what needs to happen. So if you want to change whatever you want to change in an organization, you will probably need to use governance to make that change. So it has a very fundamental character in the changes we want to make. Same on a societal level, right? If government works the way it is, then it will shape what decisions can even be made. Complete.
Awesome. Yeah. What I hear from your answer is reminding me about one of my kind of super gurus and mentors, which is John Vervaeke. He's talking all about like agency, the importance of personal agency, the meta crisis, and even the meaning crisis, etc., etc. So, is he also a kind of source of inspiration for you? Or do you know any other guys?
Do I know any other, like any other of that category, like him? And yeah, I mean, as I said, yeah, there's so many different frameworks that I've been influenced by. Like a lot of what I will talk about also comes from a viable systems model, like there's so much from all the different places. I don't even know where to start mentioning things.
Okay. So I think we are now all curious about kind of longer, deeper dive to your stuff.
So let me do that. Did you want to say something else?
No, I'm sure. Oh, you're sharing something. Perfect.
Yes, I'm sharing.
Okay.
So yeah, this is the book I've been kind of making loose reference to. You can see, as Piotr was sharing, I wrote 2 other books, or this co-written about sociocracy. This one was just a straight up manual about sociocracy. Like, how does it work? What is it? And then Who Decides is a book about how to start. Not how to start in transforming an existing organization, but how to start an organization. Yeah, all the other things we've already heard. Just so you know how I spend my time, I always find it interesting hearing from other people as well. So I spend about half of my time with clients and students. I mean, a third of my time with clients and students, a third of my time just writing and networking, and a third of my time just helping my own organization figure things out. All of that within the organization. I work full-time for Sociocracy For All. So the main thing that I want to start with is this line: you don't need bosses, you need governance. This is basically the summary of what I'm going to be talking about. One thing I want to say about that is that what governance requires is clarity, at least a significant amount of clarity, enough clarity. And most people think the only way to create clarity is hierarchy. And I don't think that's true. At least not a coercive kind of hierarchy where the boss gets to override what the other people are doing. But what is really tricky and what we kind of underestimate is that going from one person to a group and from one group to several groups is an insane increase in complexity. And the image that I used for that in my book is the image of a boat, of a ship, where you need a ship to sail, right? You can't just be a bunch of sailors, you know, that's not going to work. You need some sort of vessel, and governance for me is that vessel that holds everything together and that you build together so that it holds you. And just like with a ship, if there are too many leaks, you can have the best navigation, it's going to sink. The way that translates to governance is that there are two things that typically happen around governance. One is if you don't have enough governance, if your governance systems are not tight enough, then we lack effectiveness, right? All we do is talk, it's unclear how we address things, nothing moves forward, meetings take for a long time. Like that's a symptom of not tight enough governance. The other one is, and that's also a problem, is when we create a power vacuum. It's a little bit like only having half of a ship, right? I mean, it's obviously not going to work and not going to go anywhere, but also what happens in organizations, that's where the metaphor of a ship doesn't work anymore. But if we have a weak enough system, then what happens is that informal power, and often that means power over coercive systems, people just grabbing power basically, that grows in those informal spaces. So let's see, is there else in this? Nope. So let's go back to the start. So if I am just by myself, everything is kind of easy, right? I make a decision, I look around me, I figure out what I want to do, and then I go do it. Easy, relatively easy. As a team, we need to somehow do that together. At least ideally you do it together. Of course, as I said, if you have a hierarchical system, it's all a little different, but let's assume we want to do it together. Then we have the individual aims and goals and desires and whatnot. But now we also have the team. And the team has its own aim, right? So these people, let's say this is a work team that is working on a particular project. This person might also, you know, be a pianist and have 5 children and be interested in I don't know what. But when we talk about the team aim, now we're focusing on what the team is about, the project. So now this individual doesn't disappear, but now the individual with all of their facets and nuances and interests and desires and needs exists, but also the team exists. So it's almost like there's a new species here now, and that species is the collective. So what's important to see here is that that group identity or that collective identity is different from the sum of its part, right? It's its own thing. Now, what does it mean to do that together in an organization now? So now the same thing applies. Now we have the individuals and the team of teams. And that makes organizations really, really, really complicated, because the step from going from one brain to a group is just as big as going from one group to several groups. So Now we have a lot of things at once. And what I want is a system where all of those different area or those different tiers or levels are integrated, and where we don't say, oh, I don't care who you are, just function in the team, please. We need a system that holds all of those with care. What's interesting about it is that sometimes we might have a little bit of friction here or tension, because there might be something on an organizational level that we need that goes against the team's desire. For example, if we have to have budget cuts on an organizational level, this person, or let's say this team, might say, whoa, we as a team really need the budget. And we see how on an organizational level we can't afford it. So as if they think as the team, they will have a different wish than if they think as the organization. That shows you that, again, there's a new species. Now it's the organization that has its own everything, or just like in Reinventing Organization, one talks about the evolutionary purpose of an organization, right? So I'm kind of on the same level with that, of just saying a team is different from a sum of its parts, and an organization is as well. Okay. Now I'm stealing an idea, or not stealing, but I'm borrowing an idea, multi-level selection, which is something I learned from prosocial. And that is a cultural evolution. And it's the following idea. And that is that every time we have, that it's the same pattern plays out on different levels. And it's the pattern from evolution that there's competition on one side and cooperation on the other side. Let's look at it on team level, or on individual and team level, and then I'll explain it here. So if we have individuals, they are in competition with each other. And that might just be as simple as who gets to bring their issue to the meeting. You know, if I bring my issue to the meeting and we talk for an hour about my issue, then we're not going to have time to talk about your issue for an hour. Okay, so there is competition. That's not a good or bad thing. It just is, because there are limited resources. So there will be competition. On the other hand, we're not always just in competition, but there's also something that unifies us, right? That's the place of alignment, of cooperation. And we do that because it is useful for us to act as a group and to figure out as a group what we can do. So cooperation has its benefits and competition has its benefits. One of the benefits of competition is to make do with whatever resources we have, to innovate of how can I make more of the thing that, like given that there are constraints, well, how can I make more of that? So there's a lot of innovation in this space and a lot of alignment in that space. And both of them are good and important. And one thing that multi-level selection says is that that happens on all of the levels. So on same game here. So you have a team that competes with other teams, for example, for funding, but of course would align as an organization. And then you can think of it even in higher levels, like you can think about it as different organizations compete for funding and customers and attention, while you might form some sort of alliance of organizations where they cooperate. The basic pattern of that pull into the direction of competition and the pull in the direction of cooperation, that same pattern will be there all the time. Now, what we can do with that is, we can be sad about that is so, or happy or whatever. It all doesn't matter because it just is. So that doesn't go away. It's neither good or bad. But one thing that Elinor Ostrom, for example, studied, she studied the successful governance of shared resources in the commons. And what she found was that the thing that holds those things together is governance and agreements. If you only have competition, you're going to create a system like the tragedy of the commons, where the free rider is just, exploiting whatever resource there is. There is, just seeing the comment in the chat, I think there is some good things to say about competition. It's the rampant, kind of unrestrained competition that's a problem. So What we need is a both and. We need to create spaces that are safe enough to allow for autonomy and allow for unity. And governance is the thing that creates that. Now, can mute that? Okay. Now, let me look at some organizational patterns here. I call them in my book, I call them the blob and the bagel. These are organizations that I encounter a lot. So I'm talking about these specifically. The blob is what we see here. It's when an organization does not have enough agency to do things. And I can tell a particular story that I'm also telling in my book. The book is full of stories where somebody said, the organization should do this and that. That's sweet, but the organization should this or that is not a useful statement, because an organization is a we, right? So who's doing it? Especially in a self-organization a statement like these organizations should this or that is completely pointless, because either you do it or you tell somebody to, like, you ask somebody to do it. But just stating it like that is typically a sign that people think of the organization as something that can just go do things. But an organization can just go do things. They need that internal structure for it. So a blob doesn't have agency. The other one is the bagel. And that is also a kind of organization that I see particularly in the spaces that are teal organizations. They often err too much on the autonomy side and too little on the unity side, where often shared purpose and excitement about purpose is the one thing that they share. But that's not quite enough to do shared sense making, to do strategy, to have conversations about the budget, all of those things. So there's just not enough, like, it's not all filled in. There's kind of this hole in the middle. That's also very common. And they will often lack effectiveness. Like, I talked to an organization that has like 50 teams, but basically nothing in the middle. And they will lack agency when it comes to, for example, changing what they put their attention on, right? Like, if they want to pivot, they will not be able to do that, because how are 50 teams where there's no center, how will they, or no structure, how will they do that? So both of those are problematic. And what I want to point to is what we need ultimately is an internal structure that is filled in all the way, right? So we need these autonomous places where people can just go act, but we also need more of a finer, granular structure in the middle to go to the higher level functions of an organization. But before we get there, let me take a little detour. I'm just highlighting a few things. Of course, I'm leaving out a lot of what I'm talking about in the book. But I said earlier that going from one individual mind to a group is a big jump in complexity. And the reason for that is if I think by myself, then I know what I know, and that's what I base my decision on. And I can do some exploration in my head of like, oh, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this. Oh, no, I'm going to do this. Okay. So there's typically 3 steps. There is knowing what I know, like considering the facts that I know. There is exploration of what I could do, and then there's decision, and then I act. As a group, that now means you have to do all those 3 things as a collective. Why? Well, imagine a situation where 20 people decide, but only 2 of them know what even the facts are. That doesn't work, right? So when you want 20 people to decide, then 20 people need to know what the facts are that will be basing it on. So now you need to create a system where 20 people are informed. So that is one of the examples of how that jump in complexity is really hard for organizations, because all of a sudden you need to take care of information flow on top of everything. Same for exploration of what could we do, same things about that. And one of the frames that I talk about there is, for example, just the simple technique of having meetings requires that we have a debate about how much we talk about what. So the image that I use for that is the image of a river where you can bump into different sides. Like you're trying to kind of stay together, right? You're sailing together around the things that you know, around the things that you want to do in the same direction. Now, if you, some people might know the term "good enough for now." That's often used for consent decision making, which I'll talk about in a second. So there's, instead of perfect proposals, we're playing for good enough, but I'm adding a bunch of other enoughs. So for example, we can't as a group talk until everything is 100% clear, but we go for clear enough and then we base it on. So we need to navigate together what knowing things together means, what exploring things together means. Because for example, if you explore what you might do, you could do that for years, right? But when do you say, okay, now it's enough, now we're going to pick something and do it? But while one mind on their own might have an easier time deciding when they've explored enough, now you need to negotiate as a group when it's enough. And that's already pretty hard. So there are a lot of hard things here. The other one is when are we aligned enough? And that often comes up in organizations when they have long discussions about what their values are. How much do they even need to talk about their values so they can put out that new project? That's a discussion. Some people need to perfectly know that they're exactly on the same page to do a first thing. And some people are like, well, I don't feel aligned enough, I can just go do something. So all of those are now things that skills that we need and processes that we need, that we got ourselves into because we're trying to make decisions as a group and not alone. So we've just gotten ourselves into a lot of complexity. You might be wondering about what this is about. So because I don't think perfect is possible and maximum everything, what we need to learn is not to go for perfect, but go for navigating by red flags, right? So how do we notice that we weren't clear enough? How do we notice that we haven't explored enough? How do we notice that we're not aligned enough? So instead of just assuming that we can be in the middle of the river in the perfect alignment all the time, how can we figure out, okay, this is good enough. Now it's actually not good enough anymore. Now we need to talk a little more. And that is a way to navigate as a group. Okay. A few more things, and then I'll be done. Doing things together. So here's one of the things that really is interesting to me, because if you think about back to multi-level selections of individuals, groups, and groups of groups, in our decision making, the question is, what do we optimize for? Do we optimize for individual aims or for collective aims? So now if you look at some of the typical decision-making method, majority vote means that each individual votes for what they want, right? That's what how voting works. That means we're optimizing for individual aims. We're not optimizing for collective aims, which to me makes pretty clear that majority vote is not a useful decision-making method to form collective action. Consensus has a tendency, it depends on how it's practiced, but it can have a tendency to also optimize for the individual, especially if you allow for people to just block things without reason. Consent decision-making, on the other hand, is the decision-making method where you can only object if whatever proposal there is harms the collective aim. So you're optimizing for the collective level. So consent is the appropriate decision-making method to get alignment on a collective level, while the others are not so useful and only useful in other spaces, actually, but not for this use case. So that's something that I'm kind of picking apart there. Let's see. Last two slides. Going back to groups of groups now. As I remember the bagel where there was not enough kind of in the middle. And that is relevant when we have organizations that don't have enough agency, that are not able to move forward as a group. And I know a ton of organizations like that. For example, organizations that would like to update their mission and change their mission, but don't know how to do that because they don't know who decides that. They're very common. In hierarchical spaces, it's easy. Somebody owns the whole thing, and just calls the shots. But in a collective space, often people don't have that level of agency because they don't create the governance structures to hold those decisions. And then they get stranded there. So the aim and the mission, being able to not only have, but also change an aim and a mission is a requirement for collective agency at the organizational level. Another one is information flow. Having a well-designed way to let information trickle through the organization in an intentional way is super important, because also we base our strategy and our budget on it. Earlier I said when a group wants to make a decision, they need to be informed on the same reality, like they need to share some commitment to facts. Information flow on an organizational level is basically the whole same thing on an organizational plane. So for the organization to flow together, they need to have enough shared reality on what the facts are that are relevant. And the other one is governance. If they don't agree on what their governance system is, that's a problem, right? Because then they will never form that level of alignment that they need. Now, one thing that I'm spending a lot of time on in my book, but which I can't do here, just is that if we think about multi-level selection, there is something to say about decentralization because it leads to autonomy, but it also can fragment. And there's a lot to say about centralized organization because it leads to unity and alignment, but it can kind of it can be bureaucratic and also not consider context well enough. So what we need is balance, but balance not only on one level, but maybe even allow for a different way of balance on all of the levels. For example, you can have an organization that has a decentralized budget, but a centralized strategy. You can have an organization that has centralized HR, but decentralized salaries. Like you could have all kinds of combinations of things. It's not a one size fits all. We have to have the tools in order to play with that in an appropriate way. Okay, so that goes to my summary slide here, and then I'm curious just about reactions and whatever you want to say. So, as I said, it's about integration. So integration of all the levels. We need to let individuals be on a team level while optimizing for outcomes on the team level. On an organizational level, we need to let teams be as much as we can, but also optimize for organizational aims. All of that requires a lot of governance literacy, because we need to know when our system is tight enough so that we are as effective as we want to do, so that we're making decisions together because we know how to do it, so that we can avoid those informal power systems that grow when we don't have enough clarity. And this I already spoke to, so that is my summary.
Wow, awesome. Thanks, Ted. Thanks for this. I have my questions. I'll leave the stage open to other participants first. Guys, if you have questions, feel free to bring them up. Otherwise, I'll start with one of the first one. So maybe this is kind of the first one is about the distinction between the bulk, you call it, and the bagel. I don't know how you call the first one. The
blob.
Blob, yeah, just the blob and the bagel. So, do you actually look for something in the middle, which can also be kind of represented metaphorically by some kind of shape, or it's not the point, right? I mean, maybe.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you know, it kind of goes towards like an organizational structure that would have something filled in here, right? So who is holding, how do you hold the middle, right? And that basically goes to like what holocratic or sociocratic structures look like. They do have something filled in here, right? They have
Yeah,
general
exactly.
circles and so on. So they have that. Yes, that's true. I didn't show that, but I guess to me, still, the systems like holacracy and sociocracy are kind of that ideal of actually having everything filled in, because everything lives somewhere, and everything that doesn't live somewhere, there is a process to put it somewhere so that it's a self-repairing system. Because just having everything filled in is not even enough. You know, also need a mechanism by which to modify how it's filled in. So there's a lot of requirement there for a living system. Anyway, sorry, but where were you going with this?
No, it's probably, yeah, I think what the holacracy was at some point challenge was the presence of the central circle, which kind of constituted the kind of some kind of vertical structuring, right? So a bit of hierarchy, that the lower circles, they were kind of having like single point of contacts with this big central circle. But it was just of curiosity, because I'm always looking for visuals. You know, visuals are my language. Maybe one more thing, because the governance, like I know many frameworks in agility that provide some kind of governance, but these are more process-oriented governance structure. Do you see somehow the synergy between like frameworks offering the process governance, like I don't know, Scale Ledger framework, with what you're approaching from the sociocracy, and with having the governance of decision making, communication, rather than, you know, the processes as for instance safe focuses on. Is there kind of like a, do you see it as irrelevant, or how they interact, these two kind of governances?
Mhm. Well, to me, those are great in the area of self-management, right? But what I'm talking about is self-governance. So who decides that you're safe? That's the question that I'm interested in. You know, who decides that? How does that get decided? So self-management being like, how do you divide up the work and how do you do the work? You know, that level of self-organization. But then self-governance is, okay, who decides what the overall mission of this organization is? Who decides what a governance is? How do you do all of that? So in a way that nests, like self-management to me nests under self-governance. Um, Another thing that I want to say is that a system like sociocracy is really strong on creating the constraints and the guidelines around operations. So like, for example, you know, just governance and policy decisions create guardrails or guidelines, constraints, whatever you want to use for the operations. But there can be additional systems, of course, like Agile, to improve how we do operations. So again, to me, that's a nesting. That's just something that's nested. And it goes back to what I said earlier. Just because I focus on governance, I'm not saying that the others are not important. You know, you need all the other things, and Agile being one of them. But Agile doesn't have any answer on how you decide who decides what. It just doesn't have anything.
Yeah. Thank you. That's pretty good answer for me. Thank you. Maybe one more question, and then I'll shut up. So let's talk about the kind of enablers that you see for these kind of experiments and new setups to happen, right? Because companies exist in some kind of on some kind of arena, right? The arena has, you know, set of rules, like bring me more return of investment, or bring me profit, or increase my GDP, right? So how, what are the enablers necessary for CEOs? Because honestly, I know quite a few CEOs who are really decent guys, and they would love to experiment with various stuff, right? But they have the executive board, and which hired them to fulfill some kind of other mission, right? Not the. So the question is, how do you see it happening? If there are, what enablers are necessary, and how do you think about introducing these enablers to allow CEOs to experiment?
Well, let me start out by saying that in order to create what I would call a power with system, we need to transcend power over and power under. So let me talk for a moment about power under and then go back to your question. Power under is an effect that is described when people don't act on power that they do have, right? When they hold back, when they don't say what they think, and so on. When they think they can't decide something, and so on. And power under is just as much of a problem sometimes as power over. When power over being when people just kind of override or like tell other people what to do, and so on. So a hierarchical system typically breeds power over and power under, right? That's what hierarchy is. And power under is kind of a response to power over that people on the other side have. Now, to create power with, if we go back to multi-level selection, right, where we have the individuals that might feel power under, and then the ruler of the team, of the organization that uses power over, we have this like a polarity, right? In order to get that into balance, we need to step into a system that is shared power. And what I'm saying is that level of shared power can only be made happen if we together step into governance system, if we basically choose to subject ourselves to a system that makes us equals and helps us operate and have agency. So one boss alone can't do a thing, really, because it requires that other people also step up. What they can do, since you're asking about enablers, what they can do is create more and more of a participatory kind of system, and more kind of buy-in and more collaboration and all of that. But ultimately, they will need to have enough agreements so that power is transitioned. Because what often happens in situations where there's kind of a benevolent boss is that the system doesn't transcend, but you kind of just put a band-aid on a hierarchical situation. So you just take the edge off, but it's still there. And I'm not saying that's the boss's fault at all, actually. I think it's everybody's fault. And one image that really helps me for that is if the boss wants to share power, power is a little bit like matter, okay? You can't just share power. Somebody needs to also receive it and hold it. You can't, otherwise you create a vacuum, right? So you can't just drop things. You don't create self-management or self-governance as a boss by just not making decisions, right? You need to create a system by which people can get empowered or feel self-empowered, or however you're going to do it, to take on power. So it needs a system to do that. So to me, it's the systems that are the answer, and not just a personal relationship or how somebody acts as a boss. That's not the way out for me. It might be the beginning of the journey, but it's not the way out ultimately. It's just a nicer label on the same pattern. So what leaders can do is to inspire to create that system. They do have the power to do that. Limited power though, because as you're saying, often they are themselves part of a hierarchy and accountable to some next level system. That's a problem. There's not a lot of great magic that I can mention about that one, because it's a problem and I've seen it go wrong so many times, that middle person that plays benevolent leader just gets fired. So it's a deeper change than just something that leaders can do alone. And one answer for me, kind of, because I've almost written myself into a little bit of a personal depression and thinking about this all, because it seems so daunting and hopeless when you think about it, what would really be needed to change it. But what I've come to is that the one thing I can contribute is more literacy around the issues, like describing those issues, describing of like, this is the problem. Like, we can't just point at the boss and say, he's not sharing. That's not enough of an answer. We need to offer alternatives that are viable. And that means people need to know how to have a meeting. They need to know how to create roles. They need to know those things. And everybody needs to know those things so that we have a viable system that everybody can operate in. Otherwise, we're just gonna play the blame game. It's not the way out. It's knowledge and skills that it's the way out for me. But that's a long path. There's not an easy fix here, I think, otherwise it would have already happened.
Thank you. Another very interesting answer. All right, so I'll pause here with my questions. Any other participants? Arthur, Divya, Matthias, any questions from your side?
Hi, I have a question about how to deal with problems where some people are more used to speak or just take the initiatives, and like you have some people that speak much less. It's quite common, especially in online meetings, I think.
Yes, and it's such a beautiful example for what I was just talking about, because there are all these dynamics that happen around that problem, right? Some people say, well, they could have spoken up, it's their problem. That's an easy answer, but not really helpful, right? It doesn't change anything. The other answer is kind of remember, maybe you weren't here yet when I was talking about that. If I look at governance kind of as, let's say governance is here, okay, individual and interpersonal things are here, and then society is over there. We can only kind of look at the organizational level and see what we can change there, right? And we're kind of stuck with the things that are true in society. There's not so much that we can immediately change about that. What we can do on organizational level is institute things like rounds, like that's a tool from Sociocracy that is really awesome and transcends culture pretty quickly, in that you make it a habit that everybody speaks. They can pass, but they're going to be asked, so, but that typically only works in small groups, which is its own thing then. So, but what rounds can't change is the fact that some people, as you say, will not speak because either of introverts or lack of privilege or perceived lack of privilege. So these are very real things, right? So to me, that's an example of how, if we only look at what we can do in organizations, we still feel that dependence on what's happening on a bigger level. Like basically, organizations are also subject to, like, as in affected by the for example, sexism and misogyny that happens on that level. So it's all interdependent systems, right? Although I kind of so neatly separated the systems, they're still super interdependent. So there's only, I think we can only manage and acknowledge and make visible, but we can't solve something on an organizational level that's a societal level. So what, and all the things we can do to manage and address and acknowledge are kind of, doing rounds, acknowledging those things, doing training about anti-oppression and what, like all of those things can happen on the organization level, but ultimately solving it, you can't on that level, I think, because it originates somewhere else. But that said, of course, if we did that work in all organizations everywhere, it would do something about society, but that's a very long game. So quick fix for now, doing things like rounds, having clear agreements on how we speak, having an agreed upon facilitator, and so many other things. Check.
Thank you.
All right. Let's hear some more questions. All right. So I usually also ask our guests to kind of end the session with one kind of high-level takeaway or a message for the audience. I don't know to what extent this is a surprise for you, but
Well, it is, but that's all right.
What would it be if you would like to give it a go? Don't worry, we can cut it off of the recording.
I have an idea. I guess I just want to leave people with an image or with a vision, I guess. And that is, so I know, kind of what I stand for, what is my personal mission, my personal purpose is advocating for governance literacy, which sounds like the most boring thing on earth. Governance and literacy are both super abstract, boring sounding things. So I'm going to wrap it in a vision. Okay. Let's imagine that instead of kids in school learning how to vote and how to talk over somebody, they learn how to cooperate in a small group and in groups of groups. And imagine that we're able to scale that into, bigger spaces like cities, bioregions. And imagine how maybe everybody in a few years comes out of school and knows all those things that I've talked about and more, and has practical experience with all of that. Just imagine the level of power and agency that we would have if everybody had those tools. Because one thing is, we teach in school how to write an essay. I don't know about you, but I have not been taught how to make a decision as a group in school. So if we invested the same level of attention that we invest on literacy, as in written literacy, and also taught people how to collaborate, which is it's kind of the next level skill, right? Writing is communication to one person. Governance is collaboration with many people. If we put the same level of attention on that, what we could do would just be, there wouldn't be no limit to what we could do together. So to me, that is super exciting. The short term for that is more governance literacy in the world. But ultimately, I'm dreaming of a world where everybody just gets those things, has learned them in school, puts them together to whatever they want to do. So that's what I'm excited about.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was my pleasure to host Ted Rao today. The recording will be shortly available on YouTube. And thank you very much, Ted. This was amazing. And hopefully see you at the next Future of Work talks to be happening soon. Have a lovely summer. Have a lovely summer break. Stay in touch and take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.